We have finally been graced by the Hog rework, and it's made an insane splash. It's been a long time since Roadhog has been viable in this way, and it's likely to make a lot of changes happen quickly to ranked, and even pro play with how much pressure he can lay out at the peak of his power. Unfortunately, there are no other changes, besides a few bug fixes, either to tanks or to any other heroes, but the rework is still good enough to shake up the tier list on top of some developments and playstyles across all ranks. But before that, let's get started at the bottom, since Roadhog's changes have made a lot of other tanks shift in state as well. If you're looking to get better at tanks, or especially Roadhog now that he's gotten a massive upgrade, use the link in the description below to get access to a GameLeap membership. There are tons of tank guides already up by multiple different coaches, and with Roadhog just dropped, expect to see a lot of extra content on how best to play him strategically and mechanically. Check it out and enjoy the video. Starting at F tier, the already suffering Wrecking Ball is basically at the bottom of the barrel now. There are just so many ways to beat Wrecking Ball compositions, and even when it comes to stalling objectives, Doomfist is definitely a lot better when it comes to clutching up with picks. Although Wrecking Ball survivability can be pretty high against some compositions, there are just so many ways to survive his damage, so he really only shines when he's the last one alive, stalling on the point in hopes that you can recover later. But it's usually best to play a hero that can actually help your team win the fights in the first place, instead of one that just delays the loss. And for the bonus Roadhog effect, not only has he already been good into Wrecking Ball, hooking to stop his engages and threatening him with one-shots and chunky damage with his whole hog and new scrap gun, but now that he's a better hero overall, there's not much of a sacrifice to counter the Wrecking Ball pick. Pigpen is also yet another way to slow down Wrecking Ball and prevent his fireball from activating or simply just prevent him from escaping quickly. Some other heroes that counter the enemy tank aren't going to be good into the rest of the stronger damage heroes and supports in the composition, like Queen being good into Sigma but not into Mei. Roadhog is now a strong pick, but the biggest reason that makes him more viable to play is his more versatile healing. If the rest of your team can't kill the Roadhog or even force him out, you might have to switch tank or make the game super difficult for yourself. It's a sad spot to be in, but Ball can still make a case for himself on maps like Gibraltar or even Dorado, where the payload objective and the high ground control is easy to manage with your grapple mobility and knockback. Next up in D tier is the second dive tank with a big version for Roadhog. It's Winston, who's also got a big problem with Pigpen. Although it's not as bad as Ravenous Vortex, getting caught in any slow makes you a lot more susceptible to damage. It makes it much harder to move around and prepare your next leap. On that note, Winston still takes a lot of experience to play, and any mistake is an instant death or forfeiture of the team fight. Not only do your engages need to be timed well with your teammates, but your jumps, rotations, and primals have to be really on point to be able to do enough to win you the games. It's not even so much that his counters are all over the place, and most tanks have pretty solid damage into him or his bubble, but he just doesn't have the tools to get picks. Similarly to Wrecking Ball, he still has the one comeuppance, the ever-powerful bubble shield that can block healing and completely zone a teamfight when placed at the right moment. But damage is at an all-time high, even though supports are still a bit weaker. Next up is Zarya, who's really hard to place. While at high charge, she can get really good damage on the front line and become a threat on most of the other tanks, even if they have shields to manage her like Reinhardt or Matra. But without high energy, which is pretty hard to get against good opponents, it's really hard to ramp up enough to the level where you can bully the other tank out of position, since Zarya doesn't have the abilities to easily get on backline. When you do get fights with non-tanks, you can still do well with high charge, but once again, you just won't be able to win consistently without at least 60 charge. She's in C tier, but with really good experience from top Zarya players, you can make it work, and even in situations where there's a lot of heavy spam against you to build up charge easily, and even a Genji or Echo player who can push in with bubbles, there are times where she will seem broken beyond belief. It's just the barrier for entry of getting good energy first that makes her a lot weaker than other tanks. She basically just always has a slow start to her value every time she gets killed or even left alone for a while. It's not the ideal state to play her all the time without fail, but she, along with most tanks right now, still have enough maps where they can abuse their strengths to the fullest and not be a throw pick all the time. On to some of the outright strong tanks right now. B tier starts with Reinhardt. Roadhog is still a bit away, and he's one of the reasons Reinhardt's fallen a bit, being just the lowest B tier pick. Ryan is kind of stuck in a rock paper scissors realm right now, where he gets outmatched with a lot of counter picks. Orisa and now Roadhog counter him outright with a lot of raw damage and stuns to threaten both the use of charge and earth shatter, along with breaking the shield pretty easily. And Junker Queen and Doomfist are respectively very good into the team that Reinhardt's protecting. And as always, if you don't have a Lucio, you lose a lot of damage and kill pressure that makes Ryan a much more balanced hero in the higher ranks, since he's both able to push fast and hold space hard with good shield management and positioning. Just being able to soak damage while you stall the point can be really good on maps like Circuit Royale, or even a lot of push maps on critical positions like the gym on New Queen Street and the bridge on Colosseo. It's not looking great to deal with the massive influx of Hog players, but with 1400 shield health, it's still a lot, and Ryan remains the fastest charging shield hero in the game with 144 per second. If you compare that to Roadhog's resource of 150 healing per second, it doesn't seem too difficult to become a better Reinhardt player with more emphasis on using your shield in the most valuable ways you can find. Next up is Ramatra, who is honestly kind of on the same spot as Reinhardt. His blocking ability in his Nemesis form is still one of the best abilities in the game for its short cooldown, comparable to Orisa's Fortify in strength and to Defense Matrix in its steady availability. He's still got the big hitbox syndrome, meaning heroes like Sigma and Junker Queen, who can be beaten by Ram with good Vortex usage and Nemesis form movement, will own him every time with accretions, jagged blades, and just raw damage output that won't miss. It's easy to think Roadhog himself won't be very good because he still has his counters in the form of anti-heals or stuns, but so do other tanks. Ramatra himself is a brawl tank that needs a steady healing stream when he engages, and if you stay alive, you're rewarded by unblockable high damage punches that can break open fights easily. When it's shut off, With that anti-heal, most of his initial pressure is mitigated as people move away from his position. He has to block and slow down as a result. The recent Nemesis form cooldown buff wasn't for nothing though, and Ramattra can last a long time in the fight without too much help. He's especially good in clutch situations, with confirmed damage and a pretty short time to kill, although against more than a 2-man advantage it might be a bit too much to deal with. Ram is definitely a good pick on brawl maps, but he still has a limit in how much punishment he can take, and it's not just damage that stops him from going in now, but now there's a funny guy walking around with a 20-meter kill zone that's going to hit your big Nemesis form 9 out of 10 times. That's not ideal at the end of your Nemesis form, and with Pigpen 2, you can see how Ramattra isn't quite hitting his stride yet. Next up in B tier is Doomfist, who was way too hastily put at the top of the list last time. His abilities may be good for countering some of the better supports and damage heroes in top compositions right now, but although his nerf isn't really affecting his overall performance, it doesn't make him better into the high amounts of CC that's showing up in the tank roster again. Fortunately, he still is one of the tanks that has a stun himself, and the mobility and clutch power to make himself a viable pick, but he's definitely not going to be hitting crazy clips any more than before thanks to Roadhog's newfound survivability. The other thing holding Doomfist back despite his pretty solid ability lineup is his verticality. Doomfist has a lot of mobility, and before the fight starts he has a lot of freedom to set up wherever he wants, but during the fight he's most effective on flat lands, where he can punch people into walls and hit his slam no problem. If you have to fight between high grounds, suddenly you have to use your abilities for movement instead of damage and CC, making it a lot harder to confirm kills. He's a decent top B tier pick, but it starts getting tough especially as one of the tanks most susceptible to Ana, Sombra, and Brigitte. Finally, at the top of B tier, it's the big man Roadhog himself. It's a massive jump from consistently being F tier to this high up, so I'll make sure to explain myself real good. Roadhog's biggest issues have been mostly solved. He's a strong hero who can be pressured out of the fight just like any other tank, but now has the tools to re-enter and keep his presence up without being just an ultimate battery that gets every single one of his hooks peeled. Let's keep in mind that Roadhog's hook is still at 6 seconds, and he now has a consistent one-shot available. Even without his Pigpen, Roadhog's basic shotgun does 160 damage without headshots and 35 damage from hook and melee. You really need to just hit a couple of small headshots with your shotgun blast to destroy anyone you catch. But even with this extra damage, if Roadhog does get too cocky, especially without his Pigpen which does have a hefty long cooldown of 12 seconds, he can still get punished if he sticks in the front line for too long, trying to farm hook after hook. But right now, his heal rework has made him equal, if not better, to the sustainability and frontline pressure that other top tanks have. It's going to be a bit scary, but all in all, he's a pretty high skill ceiling hero, and with a more flexible take a breather ability, you can definitely play skirmishes much more strategically rather than just going for hook, take damage, heal, and wait. That was basically the norm before. Now onto A tier, which is basically the same as before, starting with D.Va, who can't be forgotten considering she's also fresh off a buff. D.Va's shotgun pressure is more than ever, and it's a lot more painful for tanks who struggle to outrange her while in the duel with her. D.Va is basically the strongest dive tank who eats every other one. Even though Doomfist can outplay her and be careful and even beat her up on her own aggressive stints, he ultimately loses in the 1v1 and will even get fully peeled off by her defensive strengths. D.Va's just got a lock on the dive situation and is still a powerful brawling frontline tank with high armor and high close range damage. She doesn't have a lot of crazy abilities like Sigma or Baptiste have, but with Defense Matrix and the aforementioned brawling abilities, she can just do a lot of the most important things that tank needs to do, and really well. She doesn't quite get into the top echelon of heroes since just like Ramattra, she can be forced into a defensive mode, where she has to either Defense Matrix or die, which can prevent her from going super aggressive in some situations. But she's definitely one of the most flexible heroes out there, if not the most straight up overpowered and oppressive. Moving on to the second hero in A tier, it's Junker Queen, who I know not a lot of people agree with, but her raw power as a hero really can't be ignored. It's true that having only one defensive ability that's locked away on a long cooldown makes it difficult to survive, but Queen's power isn't in her ability to just soak damage forever in the front line. She's an excellent duelist and has one of the highest power spikes for her team through her commanding shout that doesn't even always need to be used to push super far and deep. Queen's got the range damage and even the knife utility to not need to push into melee range all the time, and also has the power to fully collapse on enemy teams when abilities have been forced, with a super potent shout and a carnage engage, and even with the potential rampage on top. Just now in the Flash Ops tournament, there have been a lot of great Queen plays, and she's even been a favorite among some of the top American tank players recently. A lot of what makes a good tank isn't necessarily how much damage they can sustain by just being the main player in front of the rest of your team, but how well they can survive in pressure positions, whether it's during an aggressive push or a defensive corner hold. Moving on and topping off A tier is Orisa, who's really still kind of the top tank for just bullying everyone else. The one thing to be careful of is that Roadhog can now shrug off his heal stuns easily, but the one thing Roadhog doesn't have on Orisa, despite being much more viable into her, is that his hooks will almost never work against an Orisa matching him with her spear. At literally the exact same cooldown, Orisa should always have a spear for every 6 seconds when the hook comes out, making it pretty easy to prevent the pick. Orisa still also gets the better of most other tanks, with her damage mitigation and stun that's always going to keep her relevant, especially in a more brawly meta. She only loses out in the top tiers to the one tank left in S tier, and with his popularity rising still, he's looking greater than ever. Sigma is still the most well-rounded tank right now, with insanely high damage potential and the utility of everyone below him combined into some of its most optimal forms. It's almost like he gets to have more abilities than everyone else, and each ability is one of the strongest parts of the kits of other strong tanks. His kinetic grasp, his shield, and even his accretion are all similar to other tank abilities, and they're all super difficult to deal with on a regular basis. Even the fact that his rock cannot be absorbed by matrix abilities compared to Orisa's javelin, for example, makes a pretty big difference for considering a ton of different matchups. He's definitely the top dog, but even Roadhog can give him a bump off his throne, since in my opinion, Roadhog can totally outmatch Sigma now in the head-to-head, but as for the rest of the team's value, it's definitely still up in the air. That's it for the new Roadhog Rework tank tier list. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time for more content and guides. If you're looking to get better at tanks, or especially Roadhog now that he's gotten a massive upgrade, use the link in the description below to get access to a GameLeap membership. There are tons of tank guides already up by multiple different coaches, and with Roadhog just dropped, expect to see a lot of extra content on how best to play him strategically and mechanically.